Okay, we are on to part 7 of our shoot 'em video. We're going to look at viewports. So let's just run where we're at so we can see where we are. Just wait for it to build. Right, so we've got our little collision map and our tile map so we can see that. And we navigate around it. It's a bit rough, but we're not worrying about complicated technicalities. We're just putting some logic together. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to build viewports. So instead of having just one view, we're going to have one for each player. Okay, and we'll split the screen in two. Now what this will do, set this up using this map, but what it'll ultimately lead to, and in the 8th part, we'll be able to make bigger maps. And once you get bigger maps, what you can do quite nicely is you can add more actors, more players. Okay, so to manage the viewports, because that can be quite complicated, we're going to create a viewport manager. Okay, so let's right click over code and say add class, and we'll call it viewport manager. Let's put a capital V. No, let's put little p. So viewport manager, and in the same way that we created the collision map, whatever level collider we called it, we'll create it as a singleton. We're going to set up these 3 parts of the viewport manager first. Okay, so we're going to create a static and private viewport manager, which we'll call instance with a little I. We're going to create a public property that's static that we can access the viewport manager through, called instance. And again, this is exactly how the messaging system works. And because it's a property, we use the keyword get. So remember, a property is just basically a function with no parameters, or no visible parameters that you have to specify. Okay, so we're just going to follow standard practice. If we try and access the viewport manager and it hasn't been initialized, then we initialize it. That's a new viewport manager, and then we return the instance. Okay, in order for this to work, we need to make a private constructor so that nobody can run another instance of the viewport manager. So there's only ever one. Okay, because we don't want more than one running, because that'd be daft. Right, what we're also going to do is we're going to add a couple of methods. One for creating a single viewport for when we're on like the title screen, and another one for creating the 2 viewports for our 2 players. Okay, but we're also going to need to create a public list. Now a list is a linked list, and we're going to look at this in the second year. It's a data structure that can have that is dynamic. It can expand and grow. So it's not like an array where we fix the size at the start. It's dynamic, so we can add things to it while we're running our code. Okay, and this is going to hold the player viewports. We'll come back to that when we start creating our little viewport code. Okay, right, so we're going to create 2 public methods. They're not going to return anything, but they're going to set things up. So we're going to create a single viewport. So create that method. It's important that what we do is we make sure we wipe anything out. So we're going to clear all the viewports that currently exist, because we don't know what state all the viewports are in. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a standard full screen viewport. Okay, now the player view object, which isn't active. Oh, I forgot to include my using statement. So let's just go to another file and take the using statements. Otherwise, I can't see the engine. So player view will now work. Right. Okay. So player view dot viewport full, and we tell it how big. Well, we want it to be the same size as the screen. So gm.screen size, and we give it a name. The name is for debugging purposes, so that if we put debug information on, it'll display all the viewports that are active and that exist. Okay, so that creates that. We need to set the player's viewport to just include the full screen one. So we're just going to create this linked list, and it's just a list of numbers and integers. It looks a bit weird, this, but it is, all that says is create a new list of integers with a preset value of 0. So we've got one item in there, one number. So the first viewport, like everything, starts at 0, is viewport 0, the one we've just created. Okay. What we then got to do is tell the engine that the viewports we want active, the active player views, is just this single viewport 0. Okay. You can turn on and off viewports as you're going during running of the game for special effects and various reasons. Okay, you could do it to show a menu. You could have a menu in a viewport that isn't always shown and things like that if you wanted to. The other thing we need to set up is we need to set our sprites, and when we're messing with viewports, we need to tell the sprites what viewports they should be rendered on. Okay, and we do that by setting the render properties, and you'll see there's different sprite layers here. We haven't talked about that yet, but by default all the sprites end up on sprite 0. So we set the view association to that same list, and you'll notice the picker's doing a lot of work for me here. Okay, let's get rid of find symbol so we can see more code. Yeah, picker does a lot of work for you because it knows what view association is. That it's a list of integers. Okay, so that creates a single viewport. And so, like I said, we'll need to go back and put that into the title container to make sure that everything gets cleared out when we're in title screen. Right, so let's create the one to create the split screen, the double viewports now. What do we call it? 2 viewports. Right, again, we're going to make sure we clear anything out that's already there. Viewport. This is the hardest bit of the code. The bit that the amount of code we've got to add to the existing code is actually minimal. Okay, but this is all setup code. Right, so we're going to create that full screen one again because we do want a full screen one for drawing information, text, and stuff like that on top of everything. So we're going to create that. Let's try and do that. Oops. Right, and then we want to make a split screen. Well, in the player view, there is a system for doing this. So let's just access viewport. So we're going to add some more viewports. So we're going to say player view, and we want a viewport pair. So we need to tell the viewport pair method what is the region. So again, we're going to say, right, well, these 2 viewports are going to fill the whole screen, and then we need to say how we want to split it. So we can say view split, and then you can see that equal doesn't make any sense for singles, but there's a horizontal or vertical split. Now I'm going to put a vertical. If you want, you can change that to horizontal. That doesn't matter. Okay. Oh dear, what have I done wrong now? Right, so there is now a third parameter, a list of names for these viewports. Now we've got 2. All right, now I'm going to do this on the next line down because this gets quite horrible and wrong. This is a list of strings. So this is another one of these linked lists. I'll type the code and then you'll see. So we've got, I'm going to call it P1 and P2. Okay, so it looks a bit long and horrendous. So I have broken it over a number of lines, and you can see that it's counting the parentheses for me, so I can see that that last one is the last one I need to put because it's highlighting that one, which was the starting parentheses. Okay. In fact, I'm going to make this a bit more readable by putting the player view on the next line. And doing the view split on the next line as well. So you might not think that's more readable, but okay. I don't want to be scrolling all over the shop. Okay, so that's created 3 viewports and we've added them, okay, to the engine's viewport list. Now what we've got to do is start setting up associations. So we're going to say that the players are going to use the picker to help viewports 1 and 2. That's the 2 split screen ones. Okay. We're then going to tell the engine what order to render the viewports. This is important. Okay, so the active player views, we give it a list. Oops. And we're going to say, right, do player 1's viewport, then player 2's viewport, and then draw any full screen work afterwards. Okay. That's important because you want certain things to be drawn last. If you start drawing all your text displays on this viewport, but you do that one first, it'll all get overwritten. So you've got to think about what order you structure. In general, the full screen one is drawn last. Okay, and that's what you'd like to set up. Right, and the next one is to set up engine manager, and we set up the render properties for the render layer sprite 0. So we say that all the sprites that are on layer sprite 0 should be rendered on the list defined as players. Okay. In fact, probably a tidier way of doing this, let's rewrite this. Instead of like making this weird list up, what we can do instead is we can say add range and then give it players, that list, and then we can say gm.engineManager active player views.add 0. So it just reads a little nicer. Okay, so we say it's exactly the same code as saying 1, 2, 0, but I'm making use of the thing I've just written, so we'll do it that way. Right, so that should create split screen and set that up. The other thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to scroll the viewport around with the player. So we're going to make the viewport manager responsible for doing this as well. Okay. So we're just going to create another public method. I'm going to put method then. And we'll call this center view. And we want to accept a position. So where is the center that we want to, let's call it center. The point where we want to position the viewport around, and we need to know which viewport we're messing about with, so we'll call that viewport num or view num. Okay, now it's important that when you're doing this we do a little bit of testing to make sure that we aren't trying to adjust a viewport that doesn't exist, okay, in case we've made a mistake somewhere, because that will crash the whole engine. So we'll do a little test. We'll say, right, as long as view num is less than our count of viewpoints, then we'll be happy to send to the viewport. So if I put in, oh yeah, send to the sprite viewport 6, okay, and there aren't 6 viewports, we'll get a crash. So what we're just saying there is, right, okay, let's just do a little test and check to make sure the viewport number that we've been given is valid. Okay, now, so we're going to say to the viewport, whichever one we've picked, viewNum, we want its X position to be the center X minus half the width of that viewport. So it's going to look like a bit of a mouthful. So let's just put all that in. viewNum dot width divided by 2. Okay, so we're saying, right, take wherever the center wants to be, and we need to move the left-hand edge of the viewport, which is what the X refers to, half a distance away from that. Okay, that's what the subtraction bit's doing. And we're going to do exactly the same for the Y, but obviously it's going to be height and Y. So we'll just copy and paste that. Oops, capital Y. What? Shift key on this keyboard's awful. Center Y and the viewport height divided by 2. Okay, so that's all the code that we need to write in the viewport manager. So let's look at what we need to modify. So we said in the title container we want to be able to run this method, this single viewport. So let's go to title container. So I wish it remembered the zoom level. So when the title container starts, we're just going to run the viewport manager. So viewport manager.instance, create single viewport. Okay, that's all we need to do in title container. In game container, zoom it in. Let's go to the constructor and make sure we do this near the top. All right, we want to run the split screen viewport. So again, we're going to ask the viewport manager dot instant create 2 viewports. Okay. Right. What we also have to do, the bullet and the actors currently have a limit box. So let's have a look at bullet and see how we've got the limit box set up. Right, we said viewport action, kill past. Now, unfortunately, the bullet is going to be running inside a short, narrower viewport, and we don't want it to die when it gets halfway across the screen. Okay, so we're going to replace this viewport action for a world action. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment that line out so that I can always put it back in case something doesn't work. And I'm just going to say limit. So I'm just in the constructor for the bullet. Okay, remember the constructor? I know I've said it a few times, but it's a method that doesn't have a return type and has the same name as the class. And it's the thing that's called first. So I'm just going to say viewport, but I'm then going to say region action. So this allows me to specify any rectangular area. So this can be used to make little like windows where certain sprites can exist. So we're going to give it the box, and we can ask the engine what the size of the world is, and I'll talk about that. So we can say world box, and the limit action is going to be the same thing. We're going to say limit action dot kill past. So as soon as we go outside that region, the world box will kill the bullet. Okay, so the world box by default is set at the start to the screen resolution. Okay, so whatever times you said the window was, the world box is set to that. But we can modify that, and we'll do that in the next video when we make a bigger map. Right, so we've done that for the bullet. We now need to go to the actor. Okay, so let's go to actor. And we need to change the viewport code for that. Let's just zoom this in a little bit. So in the constructor for actor, we add viewport action stop at. And again, if we leave it as that, we'll only get halfway across the screen and it'll go all weird. So let's comment that line out. Use the little comment thing at the top. And we're going to say limit dot region not reference equals region action. And we're going to use the engine world box. And we had stop at as a limit action. So we can say stop at. So that we don't go outside the play area effectively. Right, so the other thing we want to do, and we're going to scroll down to the bottom of the constructor. Remember, that's the last line of the constructor. You can see when I highlight that, if I scroll up using the scroll wheel, that the opening brace is marking the start of the actor constructor. Okay, so before that line, I'm just going to add an update. So there's already an update created, but we're going to add another one. Okay, and we're going to call it scroll view. So this is going to be responsible. Every time the sprite is updated, we're going to reposition the viewport around it. So we're going to generate the method stub for that. Delete the exception code. We don't want that. And then we should just only have to ask the viewport manager to center the view, the last method we created in there. Right, so the position, the 2D position we want is position 2D of the sprite. And the view number is quite cleverly the same as the player number. So we've got player 1 and 2, and we've got viewports, not 1 and 2. 1 and 2 viewports are the ones that we associate with the players. So we use that number directly. Okay. The other thing we need to do in the level, where's level? The level map, we need to tell the level map what views it's associated with. Otherwise, it won't be drawn properly for each player. Okay, so on well, just the last line of the constructor, there isn't much code in here, is there? We're going to do two things. We're just going to make sure that the engine size, so we're going to say world size, is the same as the area of this tile map. Okay, so this dot area just says, right, how big is this tile map? You can make tile maps hundreds of thousands of pixels wide if you wanted to. It'll take you ages, but you can do that. Okay, like I say, in the next video, we'll make a bigger world. Right, so that just makes sure that we've got that set ready to say to the engine, "Oi, that's how big the world is." And then we need to do the view association. So we go render properties dot view association. Now this is the players field in the viewport manager. So if we say viewport manager dot instance, and then we got players, it's the only field. So if you look, when we put dot, it lists all the public methods and all the public fields. There's only one public field, and that's just called players. Okay, which should just have the numbers 1 and 2 in a list. Right, now that should be all we need to do to make this work. Oh, it'd be a miracle if this works. Let's just run it and see what happens. And then I'll do a recap to explain what we've done. Right, so +1 to start. Right, now it doesn't look like it's worked because we've still got a single screen. But let's just move player 2 and you'll see what happens. Well, hopefully we'll see what happens. There you go. The second half of the screen is scrolling around with player 2. And you'll see that he's drawn twice because he's associated with viewport 1 and viewport 2. Now you can be sneaky and make things invisible if you start putting sprites on different layers. Okay, so that's scrolling. Now the screen is the same height as the viewport, so it doesn't scroll up and down. But you'll see that the players are all drawn twice. It's really jerking in Cam Studio, but it's a hell of a lot smoother than that. It runs at a fair old lick, this code. I've done it as reasonably efficient for once. So we're having to draw everything twice, but we're only drawing half the screen twice, so it's not a massive penalty, although it does have an effect. Okay, so we got the viewports. So you should be able to see, if I come down here, you'll see the effect, if I can find the right key. Because they're not joined up, it's quite a bizarre effect. Okay, so that's prepping us for doing more player access. So let's have a look at what we've done. So we created a viewport manager. So we created our standard singleton using these three items. Okay, we created a public list of numbers to say what viewports were being used for the players. Now that's being used by the level map so that it knows how many times it has to draw it itself. Okay. We then just created a method that set up a single viewport. So this is what the engine automatically does normally. There is always one viewport, but because we're messing about and changing it between two viewports and three and one viewport, we have to go back. We then created another viewport. So if we just look at this one in a little bit more detail. So we cleared all the viewports first, then we added a full screen viewport. So that's viewport 0. Then we added a pair of viewports that were vertically split, and I'll change that to horizontal to show you what the effect of that is in a minute when we run it again. We gave them names, and we've just called them P1, P2 and full screen. They're for debugging purposes. Then we set up the players list to say, yeah, viewports 1 and 2. Then we've said to the engine the active viewports are the players ones, and this is the render order, remember. So we want the players ones to be rendered first, then render any full screen stuff. Okay, and then we also set the render properties for the sprite layer 0 to be those viewports 1 and 2. Okay, and then probably the most complicated bit of code, we created a little method that would center a numbered viewport, viewNum, around a given position, center. And we do that by subtracting half the width and height of a viewport from the X and Y center position. Okay, that's because the viewport X and Y, these two here, are actually the left and top. So the top left corner. So that's how you center things. If you want to draw it out on a piece of paper, you'll see that that's true. Okay, so any sprite that needed to worry about staying within the world area, we used a limit box, but we used region action, and we just set it to the whatever the engine's world box is. And we did that for the actor as well. Okay, there on that line. And then we just added an update, which would scroll the viewport by calling the method in the viewport manager. Okay, and that's called every time the engine updates the sprite. So that's with our default setting, it's 100 times a second, which arguably you don't need to do. You could actually say every time it's moved, update the viewport if you wanted to like make the game more efficient. You could do that. Okay, but we're not bothered about that. We're not worrying about over complicating things when it's good enough. Remember that old adage, that saying I've said a few times, that perfect is the enemy of good enough. If it's good enough and it works, fine. As long as it's not full of errors, we're not bothered whether it's not necessarily efficient. If the resources are available, let's just use them. Okay, so let's run it again just to see that horizontal split this time. I always find horizontal split on a widescreen doesn't work. It's nice to have a vertical one. I don't know why. Right, so you'll see that because it's as wide as the screen, it's only going to scroll vertically this time. And again, the jerkiness is thanks to Cam Studio. Got ya. Okay. And there we go.